respond to this news. No federal minister, secretary of state, parliamentary secretary, or Brampton MP was available for our show. Ontario Premier Doug Ford and his cabinet were also unavailable. Joining us now, however, is federal Conservative Labour critic Kyle Seaback. Hi, Mr. Seaback. Good to have you on the show. Thanks for making the time.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks.
I'm going to pick up exactly where we left off in that conversation with Mayor Brown, which is him urging the federal government to levy additional counter tariffs to essentially take a harder posture against the Trump White House where trade is concerned. I know that your party is very critical of the outcomes thus far, but do you agree with the position that the federal government should be levying additional, more punitive counter tariffs at the very least?
So look, I don't know that we accelerating the trade war by trying to actually put other tariffs on CUSMA compliant goods is the answer to that. It's something that should be looked at, and whether or not that's going to be a response that's effective should be examined. But I think the really important question is, like, how did we get here? And we got here because we've entered this bargaining with the United States in a weakened position. We can't. I just want to paint this picture. Imagine if we had developed over the last 10 years critical minerals, rare earth metals that the United States needed for their economy. But we couldn't do any of that because we have anti-development legislation like Bill C-69 and others. We can't get our oil and gas to tidewater so that we could say to the Americans, well, we're actually going to divert more of our oil into the international markets. So we would have bargaining position with the United States in these tariff discussions. But we don't have any of that because the Liberals have done that. And Mark Carney has not done anything since he's been Prime Minister to try and fix any of these things. We still have an industrial carbon tax. We still have an EV mandate that is very challenging for our auto workers. I know you recall all of the CEOs of the auto workers went to Prime Minister, went to Mark Carney and said, please get rid of the zero emission vehicle mandate. It's making it harder for us to manufacture cars in Canada. There's solutions to these things. Improve our bargaining position by strengthening the Canadian economy. And actually, in this last campaign, we campaigned on removing the HST from Canadian-made vehicles. I've talked to Unifor auto workers. We actually have the capacity to increase auto production in Canada if more Canadians bought cars. So why aren't we looking at these solutions as, again, a pressure tactic in our negotiations with the Americans? But Mark Carney and Liberals aren't doing that. They're threatening legal action, which, sure, I used to be a litigation lawyer. 10 years down the road, after the lawsuit's over, maybe something happens. That doesn't help auto workers now.
I take your point, certainly, on the focus on the economy as it stood entering in on this. And I've asked ministers who oversee the files that you mentioned numerous questions over numerous months about that very thing. But we do, to intimate that we don't have the leverage that we could. I mean, we have some pretty strong leverage. Right now, the U.S. is taking in a ton of our oil, for example. We send electricity, a number of provinces send electricity directly to U.S. states. And I'll circle back to where my question started was, I know your focus is on what your party thinks the government is doing and has done wrong. But if your party were in power right now in this moment, would you be using that leverage? You know, if you say we would have had critical minerals, well, we have oil, we have electricity. Would you be withholding that? Would you be taking a more aggressive stance against the Trump White House? Because otherwise, I don't know how what you would do would be any different than what the current prime minister is doing.
Well, we can't withhold oil and gas. We can't withhold electricity. Those things would be hugely problematic. But what we can do is do things to create, like, all the investments moving to the United States. And we know that that's a combination of Donald Trump wanting that investment and the regulatory environment in Canada being so complex that businesses aren't prepared to risk capital to make the investments that we need to get projects going. So I go back to what I said. The best time to plant an oak tree was 25 years ago. The second best time to plant it is today. So a Conservative government elected 6 years ago would have been moving on, 6 months ago, would have been moving on all of these things. We would have eliminated the industrial carbon tax, which would help our steel and aluminum. We would eliminate the zero emission vehicle standards, which is going to help our auto. Would have implemented the Made in Canada auto solution that we talked about. All of these things. What we're getting from the Mark Carney Liberals is we're going to strengthen the auto sector. He said that in March. He hasn't. We're going to have a deal in July 21st. We haven't. And all the while we're bleeding while they're not taking any action. We actually have ways to strengthen the Canadian economy to create resilience in the face of some of these tariffs, and they're not doing that. That's the problem.
It might create resilience, relative to the positioning with the United States. But when you highlight the industrial price on carbon, for example, and the EV mandate, those are two things that our free trade agreement initiated under the Harper government and completed under the Trudeau government view as very central by Europeans. We are looking to diversify markets away from the United States towards Europe. Is risking some of the, main tenets, or at least on the environmental side of agreements with Europe and specific countries, is that worth risking in order to, maybe create a better environment vis-a-vis the United States with no guarantees of that materializing?
Well, first of all, I don't think we export a lot of steel to the EU, but the EU actually exempted their steel industry from a carbon tax, and we haven't done it. In fact, Mark Carney has said the industrial carbon tax is going to go up. But if you're looking at a 25%, if you're looking at the tariffs on steel and aluminum, imagine if we eliminate the industrial carbon pricing regime so our steel and aluminum is cheaper. That actually might increase our exports to the United States, despite the fact that these tariffs are in place. If we eliminated the zero-emission vehicle mandates, that would give certainty to the auto producers that good place to invest without this uncertainty on what the conditions are going to be. If we had a policy to exempt all Canadian-made automobiles from HST, look, Canadians would choose to buy that Canadian vehicle if it's going to be $10,000, $12,000 cheaper or $8,000 cheaper. So what I say is, it's very hard to negotiate and figure out what exactly Donald Trump wants. When you can't control that variable, you have to control what you can control within your own country. There's lots of levers that the government could be pushing, whether it's on the development side, whether it's on the auto side, all of these things, and they're just not doing it, while at the same time not getting a deal. It's a double whammy, and it's the workers that are paying the price.
They have paused, to be fair, the EV mandate, and they've got the rest of it up for review. They have, with your party's support, passed a bill known as C5 that will allow cabinet in the development of resource projects to override certain environmental policies that exist. And just a few days ago, the Prime Minister didn't rule out that being the case. They're just not doing it necessarily in the way you want them to. But does that mean that they're doing nothing? It wouldn't appear that's the case.
Well, so I don't think what they're doing by setting up an office to pick projects is the answer to creating the investment environment that we need in Canada. What we need to do is eliminate, for example, all these pieces of legislation and the red tape to create investment certainty. What businesses say is the risk of trying to get these big projects off the ground is too high because of regulatory uncertainty, so they're not going to make the investments in Canada. And the Liberals setting up an office where they get to pick projects sounds to me like another opportunity for the Green Slush Fund to take place. It just leads to all kinds of opportunities for bad actors. We wanted to create an environment where all businesses get the opportunity to take risk because they know that there's a predictable process for whether or not their project's going to be improved. That actually creates, if you have 15 companies trying to get these things done, you create more investment in Canada than if you have 5 companies that are handpicked by the Carney government.
Okay, I've got to leave it on that note. I'm out of time. Mr. Seaback, thank you very much for your time.